What about the argument that some of these sites may just not like how they're displayed in Google, which may be directly correlated to the strength of their business and what they have to offer?
That argument is totally bogus, and you don't have to take my word for it. If you look at the Federal Trade Commission report that 60 Minutes cited, that's been up on the Wall Street Journal website for 2 years now, you'll see in the footnotes that the FTC got Google's internal emails, and they show that Google specifically made a list of competitors to target with the goal of bringing those competitors down 20% in their search traffic hits, and they changed their algorithm repeatedly to get that result. And then they reported back to their superiors that they had, in fact, achieved their result. So I don't understand how these Google people with a straight face can go on saying what they're saying. It is directly belied by the FTC report.
You say that the government isn't enforcing the laws that we have. Do you also believe we need new laws or lawmakers who better understand the power of technology?
Well, we could certainly use more lawmakers who might get interested in this sector and understand how it affects their constituents. But I don't think we need to go off on the long rigmarole of trying to pass new legislation. We have legislation that worked fine against Microsoft. It just has to be enforced. The problem right now is it's not being enforced, or at least it wasn't in the Obama administration. It needs to be enforced now. If that doesn't work, we can try something else, but I think that will work. It worked against Microsoft.
Now, Brian, Treasury Secretary Steven Mnuchin was asked about this report. He didn't call out Google specifically, but said that, tech companies in general, the DOJ needs to take a closer look. Does that concern you for Alphabet shareholders?
Well, it doesn't. I think when you look at Google and you look at all the businesses that they're in, if something ever came down antitrust-wise and say they had to break up the company, it would probably be worth a lot more. Right? I mean, they're number one in the smartphone operating system market by sure. They've got a great Waymo driverless car. They're number one in search. There's a lot of different YouTube, 1.8 billion monthly subs. They've got a lot of great businesses, under this umbrella. And so, sure, you should always look at any big company that's abusing their power. And so I think that's a given.
Interesting, Gary, that if Google was broken up, there's an argument to be made it could be worth a lot more, and that these companies separately could be even more powerful. How do you respond to that? I mean, and if Google is broken up, how should it be?
Well, first of all, I think that there's a good chance these individual constituent parts would be worth more. I mean, historically, we know that when Standard Oil was broken up, that's when John D. Rockefeller got most of his net worth. But the fact that they're worth more individually does not mean they're more powerful. You see, they can't conspire with each other as separate individual companies. In many cases, they would have to compete. At the very least, they would have to enter into contract negotiations, and other people would be able to compete against them more readily. So I agree with the other commentator. There is a good possibility they could be worth more to shareholders individually, and I think that's something that we ought to think about down the line. But the first step is to have a public trial so we understand what the remedy should be. We can't just jump to breaking them up. We don't know how to break them up exactly. We need a public trial so we understand what the issues are.
Now, interestingly, Facebook has been the company that's been in the regulatory spotlight over the last few weeks, though Google spends far more on lobbying in Washington than Facebook or Apple. We actually pulled the numbers on that. I'm curious, Gary, how do you think Google compares to Facebook when it comes to the idea of being a monopoly, given that Facebook also owns WhatsApp and Instagram and Facebook Messenger? Is Google so much bigger an offender?
Well, I think that Google has been an offender longer. I try to be careful about my comments on companies, and I've spent a long time studying Google, 9 years. But I haven't gotten those kind of complaints yet about Facebook, so I want to be more circumspect in terms of what I say. I don't think the right approach is to try to compare one to the other. Rather, we evaluate each one against the legal standard. Right now, there's a complete record in Europe. There is a record developed by the FTC in the United States, all with respect to Google's antitrust behavior. We ought to move on that record. That's the next thing that needs to happen.
So, Gary, last question. You actually pursued the case against Google in the EU. The company was fined $2.7 billion. Google is appealing that decision. How do you expect this to play out?
Well, I would expect in Europe, this is a decision by the European Commission, and I would expect that the courts will uphold the European Commission, not only because their record is good and their investigation was thorough, but because the courts there always uphold the European Commission. So Google's going to lose that money. But whether that one investigation and decision by itself will curb Google's behavior, I'm not sure that's the case. The EU is going to have to do a lot more if they want to bring Google to heel.
Brian, do you think that any of this will substantially change Google's business? Obviously, you're still recommending the stock. What could change that?
You know, I don't think in the near term, but I think all of these are great data points to think about, longer term, how Google needs to change. I think a lot of these big tech companies in some way need to change a little bit because as you get bigger, like I said, it's tougher to grow. And maybe there are some people doing things they shouldn't. And that's something, the top executives should take a look at.